Hi, this is my presentation on initial response to exercise. So I'm going to start with respiratory dynamics. Ventilation, breathing rate and tidal volume are all linked to each other, and there is an equation which shows how they go together. This is VE equals BR and TV. Ventilation is the movement of a certain amount of gas which moves into and out of the lungs. It's the exchange of air between the lungs and the atmosphere, so oxygen can be exchanged for CO2 in the alveoli. Breathing rate is the number of breaths that a person will take per minute, and the normal breathing rate for an adult who is resting is around 12 to 20 breaths per minute. However, during exercise, if intense, breathing rates may increase from around 14 to 15 to around 40 to 50. This would be seen in a 800-meter race, for example, or cross-country skiing or cycling, because there's a higher demand for oxygen delivery to the muscles to make ATP energy. Finally, tidal volume is the volume of breathing rate put together, is the volume of air that moves into and out of the lungs during each ventilation cycle. Tidal volume is the breathing rate put together which makes up ventilation. Tidal volume and breathing rate put together makes up ventilation. So if one of these are changed, then it affects the overall ventilation. Ventilation will change and alter during exercise because the body is sensitive to increases in carbon dioxide levels, and so it will change in order to match this. Furthermore, ventilation will change due to increases in the intensity of the activity, which causes a greater carbon dioxide level in the blood and a higher need for oxygen disposal for the muscles. For example, in a marathon, there's a higher demand for oxygen disposal because there's more energy needed as it runs over a longer amount of time than a quick burst of energy which is needed for an exercise such as shot put. The differences between the different breathing rates for different stages, such as at rest, pre-exercise and during exercise, are important as they change the levels of oxygen intake to match the demand. For resting before exercise, the typical breathing rate for an adult will be around 12 to 20 breaths per minute. This is because there is no great need for shallow, rapid breaths, as the demand for oxygen pre-exercise isn't high, as the muscles have no air and not a great need for extra supply of oxygen to contract. In contrast, during exercise, the typical breathing rate will be around 40 to 50 breaths per minute, and this is because there is a high demand for oxygen to be transported to the muscles during exercise, as there is more energy needed as ATP, which requires oxygen. At college, we ran an experiment with a multi-test fitness experiment, where participants had to run for a certain amount of times, which varied across the diameter of the hole. The shortened time for them to cross the same amount of length increased the intensity and difficulty. The demands increased because it became more challenging as they had a shorter amount of time to run across. And the reason this was also challenging is because of the demanding nature of the test, as there isn't enough time to rest and allow the phosphocreatine to resynthesize ATP enough. And so the demand for energy is high from oxygen, but the muscles began to fatigue, which would cause tiredness for the athlete. From the data received from the test, as you can see in the graph at the bottom here, the different factors which overall affect ventilation were discovered. For example, the data received shows that at rest, blood lactate, which is an ionic form of lactic acid that is produced by muscle cells, red blood cells, the brain and other tissues during anaerobic exercise, at rest is a low amount in the blood because this is because the cells and muscles the cells in the muscles haven't had needed to convert the muscle's aerobic energy into anaerobic energy where the lactic acid is released. In less demanding exercise such as walking, swimming, or light cycling, there will be a lower level of lactate because the anaerobic system isn't used, which doesn't need oxygen, but it produces lactic acid, which explains the higher result. However, there is an increase in the blood lactate during the activity. This is obviously due to the higher demand in energy which is required as the body begins to convert its aerobic respiration, which actually occurs in the mitochondria inside the cells, into anaerobic exercise, which produces ATP energy. But when there is a lack of oxygen due to the increase in exercise and demand for oxygen, it changes to anaerobic respiration. And so the blood lactate begins to increase. For example, in the multi-stage fitness test, we can see this as they carried on running, the blood lactate increased as they converted their aerobic stores into the anaerobic stores. As the test proceeded, the demand for oxygen became higher and more important. One way the body can attempt to supply the muscles with enough oxygen is by increasing the breathing rate and converting to more shallow and rapid breaths in an attempt to supply the body with it. This is why on the graph there's clear visibility in a gradual increase in the breathing rate, because as the exercise gets harder, more energy is needed, which is produced from oxygen, so there's a higher intake. For example, at rest, a person will breathe normally with long, deep breaths spaced out. This explains how at rest the breathing rate was 16 breaths per minute, which is low. However, in the middle of the test, the breathing rate was 24, which shows that the exercise does cause an increase in the demand of oxygen. Seen on the right of the screen, there is another graph which shows how at the beginning of the exercise there is a quick oxygen deficit. The volume increases, and then there is a plateau of the line where the oxygen intake is very high. However, there is a low point in the graph which shows that less oxygen is being taken in, because they've converted to the anaerobic stores, which don't rely on oxygen to work. However, they do produce lactic acid. The next trial experiment performed was the Wingate anaerobic test, where the participants had to cycle for 20 seconds as fast as they can. The results for this also show the physical demand on the body's respiratory system to supply oxygen. However, my results showed that the multi-stage fitness test was more demanding, and this is because it went for the longest time and therefore there was high demand for oxygen as the muscles began to fatigue. During respiration, some air is reserved in the lungs, and no matter how much you inspire, the inspiratory reserve volume is the additional amount of air which can be inhaled after a normal inspiration, which is the tidal volume. The inspiratory reserve volume is between 2,000 and 3,000 millilitres in human beings. This is forced breathing. It's made of breathing during exercise. It's a mode of breathing during exercise which forces you to manipulate your breathing in order to get a good supply of oxygen when you're doing the exercise. However, the expiratory reserve volume is the amount of extra air which is exhaled during a forceful breathing out. The average respiratory reserve volume is about 1,100 millilitres in males and 800 millilitres in females. Expiratory reserve is the additional amount of air which can be expelled from the lungs by determined effects after normal expiration. Another lung volume is the vital capacity. This is the maximum amount of air that a person is able to breathe out of the lungs after a maximum inhalation and taking of oxygen and air is equal to the whole of the inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and expiratory reserve volume. During intense exercise such as sprints, less air is drawn in due to the small, rapid, shallow breaths, and so the lung volume will be smaller with less air. As seen on this graph here with the lines going up and down, they will be more shallow and shorter as less air is being taken in. A spirometer, seen on the bottom left, this is how it can look, can be used to measure a person's vital capacity. As they blow on the tube, the maximum air that they can get out of their lungs is measured. As seen on the diagram, there is also residual volume and capacity at the bottom. This is the volume of air pressure in the lungs at the end of passive expiration. At the end of vigorous exercise such as a sprint, this value will be very short as the amount of air is much lowered as they can't gain the amount of air that they need usually, so any excess air will be used for vital places. The total lung volume is around 6,000 millilitres, which is equal to 6 litres. This is the maximum amount of air which can fill the whole lungs as a whole. MVPA stands for Mechanism, Volume, Pressure and Airflow. During exercise, there is inhalation and exhalation as always. Inhalation involves the intercostal muscles surrounding the ribs contracting, and this causes the ribs to be pulled in upwards and then outwards, which increases the volume of the lung area and capacity. And due to the increase in volume, the pressure of air inside decreases. The diaphragm contracts and lays flat, which reduces the air pressure and increases the volume, which is important because it means that there's more room for the air to be taken in. This causes the external pressure of the environment air pressure to be higher and cause the air to rush into the lungs as it's lower inside. For exhalation, the muscles relax and therefore the ribs move inwards and down. The diaphragm relaxes and folds up in the middle slightly, and these things cause a volume of area to decrease, and therefore the pressure inside is larger than the pressure outside, and so the air will be forced out. Inhalation is triggered after exhalation happens, where all the air, apart from the inspiratory reserve volume, has been squeezed out of the lung area and thoracic cavity, and there is now a lower demand for oxygen, and so the body will switch and change certain factors such as the diaphragm position in order to allow air into the system by increasing the volume. Exhalation is triggered when the most amount of air possible has been collected and is let out.